Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Monday? Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Gail in Kansas City, Mon in Edmonton, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Tom in PA, Bill in mid-Missouri, Nancy, North Carolina, Chaim in Florida, Lynn in Canada, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Frank in San Pedro, Moishi in Brooklyn, Guy in Ohio, Marie in New York, Belle in Texas, Karen in Northern California. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 60 here in Tractate Menachot, 30th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 4 here in chapter 5, and we're right at the bottom of page 59b, and we're talking about this idea that if you place any oil, the Torah says explicitly, if you place any oil or frankincense on, which normally do accompany meal offerings, but if you put it on the meal offering of a sinner or of a sota, it's going to disqualify it. Yes, you were talking about the oil will automatically disqualify it. The frankincense, it's disqualified while the frankincense is there, but you can remove the frankincense and reinstate its validity. Okay, now the Gemara continues to discuss the placement of oil upon the meal offering of a sinner, or the meal offering of jealousy brought by the sota. Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says if one placed any amount of oil on top of an olive bulk, so we've been using that word quite a bit, the olive bulk, like the volume of an olive, right? That's the minimum measure for certain laws. Sometimes we use the egg bulk, sometimes we use the olive bulk, sometimes we use the lentil bulk. It's a funny way to say it in English. In Hebrew, we would say a ketzayis, right? So like the amount of an olive, and we get that we're not talking about an olive, we're talking about the volume of an olive. But okay, if one placed any amount of oil on top of a ketzayis, of a meal offering, of a sinner, he has thereby disqualified the meal offering. So we're talking about two minimum measures. How much oil? Any amount. How much of a meal offering are we placing that oil on? There, the minimum measure is the ketzayis. And the Gemara inquires, what is the reason for this law? And the verse states, he shall place no oil upon it, in Leviticus 5:11. And this indicates an act of placing that has no minimum amount, and therefore one is liable for any amount of oil. And when the verse states upon it, this teaches that a meal offering is disqualified by the oil only if it has the requisite measure, I guess, to constitute a meal offering, and that's going to be the ketzayis, the olive bulk. And Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says, if one placed an olive bolka ketzayis of frankincense on top of any amount of a meal offering, he has thereby disqualified the meal offering. Now we're saying a ketzayis of frankincense and any amount of meal offering. What is the reason for this law? It is written, neither shall he give any frankincense upon it, which indicates that frankincense disqualifies the meal offering only if there is at least an amount that constitutes giving, and this is the ketzayis. And when the verse states upon it, this is one amplificatory, nice word, amplificatory expression after another, one in the context of the oil and the other in the context of the frankincense. And we have a principle that one expression which amplifies following another expression which amplifies, the second one, instead of further amplifying, actually comes to restrict. Consequently, the placement of frankincense on any amount of a meal offering of a sinner disqualifies the meal offering. Now we're on page 60. And there are those who say there is a different version of the discussion. Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan raises a dilemma. If one placed oil of any amount, right, any amount, on top of a ketzayis of a meal offering of a sinner, what is the law? And the Gemara clarifies, since the Torah states with regard to oil, he shall place no oil upon it, whereas with regard to the frankincense it states, neither shall he give any frankincense upon it. Do we require that the placing of the oil must be like the giving of the frankincense, which must be a ketzayis at least to be significant, or not? No answer was found, and therefore the Gemara states that the dilemma shall stand, meaning unresolved teku. Next topic. The Mishnah teaches, if one placed oil on the remainder of the meal offering, right? Meal offering, chametz, right? Take out the handful, that gets burned on the altar, and the remainder is eaten by the priests. So the oil can't go on the handful that gets burned on the altar. Can oil go on the remainder? We learned already that will not disqualify the offering. So the Mishnah taught, if one placed oil on the remainder of a meal offering of a sinner or a meal offering of jealousy brought by a sota, he does not violate a prohibition. Concerning this, the sages taught in a baraisa, when the verse states, he shall place no oil upon it, neither shall he give any frankincense upon it. One might have thought that this separation into two distinct prohibitions applies only where two priests perform these actions, one of whom places oil on the meal offering while the other puts frankincense. Perhaps in this case, I'm going to speak a little more quietly. You know, I had the root canal on Friday, and my tooth no longer hurts, thank God. But I have like a temporary crown there, which is a little bit rough on the edge, and it's irritating my tongue. And today I did 2 interviews this morning, so I've just done a lot of talking today. I'm going to try to talk with a little less mouth and tongue movement if I can. Okay. Where am I? Okay. The Mishnah teaches, if one placed oil on the remainder of a meal offering of a sinner or a meal offering of jealousy brought by a sota, he does not violate a prohibition. And concerning this, the sages taught in a baraisa, when the verse states, he shall place no oil upon it, neither shall he give any frankincense upon it. One might have thought that this separation into 2 distinct prohibitions applies only where 2 priests perform these actions, one of whom places oil on the meal offering while the other puts frankincense. Perhaps in this case, each of them is separately liable to receive lashes for violating the prohibition, if they were warned and did it anyway. But if one priest put both oil and frankincense on a meal offering, one might have thought he receives only one set of lashes. Therefore, the verse states, upon it. With regard to both the oil and the frankincense, which indicates that the verse is speaking of the meal offering itself, and it is not referring to the priest who performs the service. Since both prohibited actions can be performed on the same meal offering, an individual who does both is liable to receive 2 sets of lashes. Furthermore, one might have thought this verse means one may not even place a vessel containing oil or frankincense on top of a vessel that contains the meal offering, and that if one placed such a vessel on the meal offering, he has thereby disqualified it. Therefore, the verse states, upon it, which indicates that the verse is speaking about the meal offering itself. One may not place oil or frankincense on the meal offering itself, right, on the dough, on the flour, but it is not prohibited to place a vessel containing oil or frankincense on top of a vessel that contains the meal offering beneath it. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 5. Mishnah 5. There are 4 categories of meal offerings. Those that require bringing near, which is a ritual that requires the priest to carry the offering in their hands and bring it near the southwest corner of the altar, but do not require waving. Those that require bringing near and waving, those that require waving but not bringing near, and those that require neither waving nor bringing near. Right? So one thing is to wave. It's a kind of presentation of the offering. We'll do this with meal offerings, and we'll do this with animal offerings. Right? It's literally like the priest waves it. And then there's bringing near. That's not the same as bringing the handful up on the ramp to the top of the altar and putting something on the fire. This is called bringing near, where they bring it to the southwest corner of the altar. So some of the offerings require bringing near and waving. Some require bringing near but not waving. Some require waving but not bringing near. And some require neither bringing near nor waving. Now, the Mishnah will begin to elaborate on these categories, and it will actually be continued in the next Mishnah. So the Mishnah elaborates. And these are the meal offerings that require bringing near, but do not require waving. The fine flour meal offering, the meal offering prepared in a pan, the meal offering prepared in a deep pan, the meal offering that is baked in an oven, which can be brought in the form of loaves or in the form of wafers, the meal offering of priests, the meal offering of the anointed priest, the meal offering of Gentiles, a meal offering brought by women, and the meal offering of a sinner. All of these are brought near to the southwest corner of the altar, but they do not require waving. What requires waving? For example, the 2 loaves of Shavuos along with the 2 lambs. Now, Rabbi Shimon says the meal offering of priests and the meal offering of the anointed priest do not require bringing of the meal offering near to the altar due to the fact that there is no removal of a handful in their sacrifice. And there is a principle that with regard to any meal offering where there is no removal of a handful in their sacrifice, there is also no bringing near. But that was the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Now the Gemara. And I'll just read where the law ended up on this question that we learned from Rambam. All meal offerings that are sacrificed on the altar, right, so the handful is removed and burned on the altar, require bringing to the west side of the altar opposite the edge of its southwest corner. That's bringing near. They do not require waving, except for the meal offering brought by a sota and the Omer meal offering brought on the second day of Passover, both of which require bringing and waving. All others require bringing near but not waving. That were on that list. Okay, now the Gemara. Rav Pappa stated a principle with regard to all the Mishnahs here in Tractate Menachot. Anywhere that we learned in a Mishnah that one brings a meal offering, we learned that one must bring 10 items of the same type either loaves or wafers. And the Gemara asks, what is Rav Pappa teaching us? And the Gemara explains, this statement of Rav Pappa serves to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says one who takes a vow to bring a meal offering baked in an oven must bring 10 items. If he wishes, he may bring 10 loaves or 10 wafers, and if he wishes, he may bring half of them as loaves and half of them as wafers. Rav Pappa teaches us that the Tana of the Mishna maintains that one may not do so. All 10 must be of the same type. It's interesting because that Gemara seems to apply to this bringing of 10 loaves or wafers to something we read in the previous Mishnah, but for some reason it's listed here. We move on. The Mishnah teaches that the first Tana and Rabbi Shimon disagree about whether the meal offering of priests and the meal offering of the anointed priest require the ritual of bringing near. So the Gemara asks from where these matters derived. And the Gemara answers, as the sages taught in a baraisa, a verse discussing the meal offering prepared in the pan states, and you shall bring the meal offering that is made of these to the Lord, and it shall be drawn near to the priest, and he shall bring it near the altar. Leviticus 2:8. If the verse had stated only, and you shall bring that which is made of these to the Lord, and it shall be drawn near to the priest, and he shall bring it near the altar, omitting the words, the meal offering, I would say, I have derived only that the handful that is sacrificed on the altar, only that requires bringing near, not the whole meal offering. From where is it derived that this law applies to the entire meal offering? So the verse states the superfluous term, the meal offering, which indicates that one must bring the entire meal offering to the altar prior to the removal of the handful. And the Baraisa further asks, from where is it derived that this law applies to the meal offering of a sinner? So the verse states the meal offering. The addition of the definite article, not just meal offering, but the meal offering, serves to include the meal offering of a sinner. The Baraisa raises a difficulty. Why is a verse necessary to teach that the requirement of bringing near applies to the meal offering of a sinner, but this law is capable of being derived in a different way, by logical inference? And the Bryce explains, the procedure of bringing a meal offering is stated here in the context of the meal offering of a sinner, and this is an obligatory meal offering, right? The sinner, he made an unwitting violation of a prohibition that if he had done it intentionally would have resulted in coarse. So now he has to bring a sin offering. Presumably he can't afford to bring an animal sin offering or a bird sin offering, so he's bringing the meal offering of a sinner. And that is an obligatory meal offering. And it is stated there with regard to the deep pan meal offering, which is a voluntary meal offering, right? Somebody wants to bring a gift. This is voluntary, not obligatory. So just as a voluntary meal offering requires bringing near, so too an obligatory meal offering, such as the meal offering of a sinner, requires bringing near, right? Bringing it to the southwest corner of the altar. Now the Baraisa rejects this inference. You might have thought that. What is notable about a voluntary meal offering? And now we're on page 60b. It is notable in that it requires oil and frankincense upon it, rendering its law more stringent than that of the meal offering of a sinner, which does not include oil and frankincense. Which is interesting, right? Is it more stringent because it requires oil and frankincense? Or is the meal offering of a sinner more stringent because it is prohibited to bring oil and frankincense with it? They're saying no, it's more stringent if you're required to bring oil and frankincense with it in the case of the voluntary meal offering. Okay. So what is notable about a voluntary meal offering? It is notable in that it requires oil and frankincense upon it, rendering its law more stringent than that of the meal offering of a sinner, which does not include oil and frankincense. Therefore, it would be logical to suggest that a voluntary meal offering requires bringing near, but the meal offering of a sinner does not. And the Baraisa responds, the meal offering brought by the sota, the suspected adulteress, i.e. the meal offering of jealousy, can prove that this factor is not decisive, as it also does not include oil and frankincense, and yet it does require bringing near. Now, the Brisa rejects the claim. One cannot derive the law of the meal offering of a sinner from the meal offering brought by the sota, as there is another requirement that applies to the meal offering brought by the sota, but not the meal offering of a sinner. What is notable about the meal offering brought by a sota? It is notable in that it requires waving, whereas the meal offering of a sinner does not. And the Brisa responds, the voluntary meal offering can prove that waving is not the decisive factor, as a voluntary meal offering does not require waving, and yet it requires bringing near. Right? We have these elements of meal offerings. Does it include oil and frankincense or not? Does it require bringing near or not? Does it require waving or not? The Torah does not list all of the requirements for each type of meal offering. And so, as we've been doing for the last few days, where the Torah is silent about which of these elements is required, we compare that particular kind of meal offering to another meal offering where the elements are listed, and we see, is it more similar to this kind of meal offering or that kind of meal offering in terms of will we extend the elements of that one to this one, or will we extend the elements of that one to this one? Therefore, the inference has reverted to its starting point, as the aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. Their common element is that the voluntary meal offering and the meal offering brought by a sota are equal with regard to the requirement of removal of a handful, and similarly, they are equal with regard to the requirement of bringing near. So I will also bring the additional case of the meal offering of a sinner, which is equal to them with regard to the requirement of removal of a handful. All of these require removing a handful. Unlike the voluntary meal offering of a priest, where there's no removing of a handful because the entire meal offering is burned on the altar. But for the three we're talking about here, meal offering of a sinner, of a sota, and a voluntary meal offering brought by an individual who's not a priest, all of them we remove a handful. And conclude that it should likewise be equal to them with regard to the requirement of bringing near. But as we've seen, the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of a sota are not the same when it comes to bringing near. So the Brisa rejects this suggestion. What is notable about the common element of the voluntary meal offering and the meal offering brought by a sota? It is notable in that they are suited to come as the meal offering of a wealthy person, just as they are suited to come as the meal offering of a poor person. Shall you say the same with the meal offering of a sinner, which is not suitable to come either as the meal offering of a wealthy person or the meal offering of a poor person, since a sinner who is not poor does not bring a meal offering. He brings a different offering, either birds or an animal. Therefore, the verse states the meal offering, with the addition of the definite article, the meal offering, to include the meal offering of a sinner in the requirement of bringing near. Rabbi Shimon adds to the logical inference and says that other cases are included in the derivation from the verse, as the term "and you shall bring" serves to include the Omer meal offering, right, that brought on the second day of Passover from the new crop of barley, as opposed to 50 days later when we bring from the new crop of wheat the 2 loaves of Shavuos. So Rabbi Shimon adds to the logical inference and says that other cases are included in the derivation from the verse, as the term "and you shall bring" serves to include the Omer meal offering in the requirement of bringing near to the altar. And so the verse states with regard to the Omer meal offering, quote, "Then you shall bring the Omer, the first of your harvest, to the priest," in Leviticus 23:10. Furthermore, quote, "and it shall be drawn near," serves to include the meal offering brought by a sota in the requirement of bringing near. And so the verse states with regard to the meal offering brought by a sota, "and draw it near to the altar," in Numbers 5:25. So it seems like there's a good connection there. But the Baraisa objects and says, but this law is capable of being derived kal v'chomer, by a logical inference. And if the meal offering of a sinner, which includes a lenient aspect as it does not require waving, nevertheless does require bringing near, then with regard to the meal offering brought by a sota, which does require waving, is it not logical to conclude that it should also require bringing near? But the Raisa says, this doesn't work. You can't make this logical inference, as there is a stringency that applies to the meal offering of a sinner, which does not apply to the meal offering brought by a sota. What is notable about the meal offering of a sinner? It is notable in that it comes from wheat, whereas the meal offering brought by a sota comes from barley, an inferior product like the omer offering. The Baraisa responds, the omer meal offering can prove that this factor is not decisive, as it also comes from barley, and yet it does require bringing near. Therefore, the same should apply to the meal offering brought by a sota. Baraisa says no. What is notable about the omer meal offering? It is notable in that it requires oil and frankincense. But the meal offering of a sota, which is made from barley, does not have oil and frankincense, unlike the omer meal offering. So the Baraisa answers, the meal offering of a sinner can prove that the requirement of oil and frankincense is not a decisive factor, as the meal offering of a sinner does not require oil and frankincense, and yet it requires bringing near. And so we've gone full circle, because each of these offerings has its own unique aspects, and when we try to compare them, we'll find that, okay, well, the omer meal offering shares one aspect with the meal offering of the sota, but doesn't share another aspect, which it shares an aspect with the meal offering of a sinner, but it doesn't share that aspect with the meal offering of the sota, etc. Right? They all have their own particularities. So under which conditions, how much similarity do we need before we can extend either the element of bringing near or the element of waving from one type of meal offering where the Torah specifies that it needs that to another type of meal offering where the Torah is silent? So consequently, the inference has reverted to its starting point, as the aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. Their common element is that both the omer meal offering and the meal offering of a sinner are equal with regard to the requirement of the removal of a handful, and they are equal with regard to the requirement of bringing near. I will also bring the additional case of the meal offering brought by the sota, which is equal to them with regard to the requirement of the removal of the handful, and conclude that it should likewise be equal to them with regard to the requirement of bringing near. Sounds good, but what is notable about the common element of the omer meal offering and the meal offering of the sinner? It is notable in that they are both not suited to come as coarse flour, but only as fine flour. Will you say the same with regard to the meal offering brought by a sota, which is barley, not fine flour, which is suited to come as coarse flour? Therefore, the verse states, and draw it near, which serves to include the meal offering brought by a sota in the requirement of bringing near. It was stated that Rabbi Shimon derives from the term, and you shall bring, in Leviticus 2:8, written in the context of the deep pan meal offering, that the omer meal offering is included in the requirement of bringing near. Conversely, Rabbi Yehuda says the term, and you shall bring, serves to include the meal offering brought by a sota in the requirement of bringing near. And so the verse states with regard to the meal offering brought by a sota, then the man shall bring his wife to the priest and shall bring her offering for her, 1/10 of an ephah of barley flour. He shall pour no oil upon it, nor give frankincense upon it, for it is a meal offering of jealousy and a meal offering of memorial, bringing iniquity to remembrance. Right? These are the words describing the meal offering of the suspected adulteress, the sota. But with regard to the omer meal offering, a verse is not needed to teach that it requires bringing near. And the Baraisa asks, what is the reason that no verse is required for the Omer meal offering to know that it requires bringing near? It is because this law is derived kal v'chomer, by logical inference. And if the meal offering of a sinner, which includes a lenient aspect, as it does not require waving, nevertheless requires bringing near, then with regard to the Omer meal offering, which includes a stringent aspect, as it does require waving, is it not logical to conclude that it should require bringing near? Sounds good. If you compare those two, one is more stringent and therefore apply further stringencies to it. But the meal offering of a sinner is brought by individuals. The Omer offering is brought on behalf of the nation once a year. It's going to be hard to learn out anything from a national obligatory offering to an individual's obligatory offering. Says the Gemara. But with regard to the Omer meal offering, a verse is not needed to teach that it requires bringing near. And the Bryce asks, what is the reason no verse is required? I'm sorry, I just read that. So the Brisa rejects this inference. What is notable about the meal offering of a sinner? It is notable in that it comes from wheat, whereas the Omer meal offering comes from barley. And the Brisa responds, well, if you're going to talk about barley, the meal offering brought by a sota can prove that this factor is not decisive, as the meal offering of a sota comes from barley, and yet it requires bringing near. Therefore, the same should apply to the Omer meal offering. And the Brisa rejects this claim and says, well, what is notable about the meal offering of the sota? It is notable in that it comes to clarify whether or not the wife committed the transgression of adultery, as it is described with the phrase, bringing iniquity to remembrance. Whereas the Omer meal offering does not come to clarify whether or not there was a transgression. It serves an entirely different purpose. It comes to permit the nation to start eating barley from that year's new crop. And so the Brisa answers, the meal offering of a sinner can prove otherwise, as it does not come to clarify transgression, and yet it requires bringing near. Therefore, the inference has reverted to its starting point, as the aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. Their common element is that both the meal offering brought by a sota and the meal offering of a sinner are equal with regard to the requirement of removing a handful, and they are equal with regard to the requirement of bringing near. I will also bring the additional case of the Omer meal offering, which is equal to them with regard to the requirement of removal of a handful, and conclude that it should likewise be equal to them with regard to the requirement of bringing near. And in this manner, the requirement of bringing the Omer meal offering near to the altar is derived jointly from the meal offering brought by a sota and the meal offering of a sinner. Sounds like it should work if you've been following the logic. The Gemara says, and how would you refute this logical inference? In other words, there is no refutation of this claim, and it is therefore unclear why it was necessary for Rabbi Shimon to derive the requirement of bringing near concerning the Omer meal offering from the term, and you shall bring. That was unnecessary. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon refutes the claim in this manner. What is notable about the common element of the meal offering brought by a sota and the meal offering of a sinner? It is notable in that they are common offerings, i.e., they can be brought many times over the course of a year, whereas the Omer meal offering is brought on behalf of the nation once a year and once only. The Gemara asks, and how does Rabbi Yehuda respond to this claim? He maintains that this is not a valid refutation, as on the contrary, this Omer meal offering is more common than the meal offering brought by a sota and the meal offering of a sinner. I mean, couldn't you have multiple sinners bringing meal offerings in a year? Couldn't you have multiple wives suspected of adultery? that bring the meal offering of jealousy. And we know that the Omer meal offering is definitely brought once and once only per year. The answer is there might be a year where there are no suspected adulteresses. And there might be a year where there are no sinners who bring a meal offering of a sinner. Right? The Omer meal offering is definitely brought once a year, whereas in the case of these other offerings, there may be times when you do not find it at all, if no poor sinners come forward and no women are accused of adultery by their husbands. The Gemara cites a baraisa. Or perhaps when the verse states, and you shall bring, this does not serve to teach about the requirement of bringing near at all, which is the way we've been reading it, but rather, perhaps when the Torah states, and you shall bring, this is written for a totally different reason, to indicate that an individual Jew may donate and bring a different kind of meal offering, one made from barley, apart from these 5 meal offerings, all made from wheat, which the verse mentions with regard to this matter in Leviticus 2, verses 1 through 13. The 5 offerings are the fine flour meal offering, the meal offering prepared in the pan, the meal offering prepared in the deep pan, and the meal offering baked in the oven, which can come either in the form of loaves or in the form of wafers. Those are understood all to be made from wheat flour. So is it possible that even though it's not mentioned in the Torah, that an individual could decide he'd like to make a voluntary meal offering and bring it from barley flour? And this law is necessary because the opposite conclusion could otherwise have been derived by logical inference based on the juxtaposition that the community brings an obligatory meal offering from wheat, i.e. the 2 loaves that are brought on the festival of Shavuos, which come to permit the nation to start eating wheat from the new crop. And that's an obligatory meal offering brought once a year on Shavuos. So too, you might have thought, an individual who brings... let me read that again. So you might have thought that, and this law is necessary because the opposite conclusion could otherwise have been derived by logical inference based on this juxtaposition. The community brings an obligatory meal offering from wheat, i.e. the 2 loaves on the festival of Shavuos. And the community also brings an obligatory meal offering from barley, which is the Omer meal offering brought 50 days earlier on the 2nd day of Passover. So too, an individual who brings a meal offering from wheat as a voluntary gift offering, which we've seen in several places in the Torah, you might think could likewise bring a meal offering from barley as a voluntary gift offering. Therefore, to prevent this inference, the verse states, and you shall bring the meal offering that is made of these to the Lord, which teaches, I have nothing other than these 5 meal offerings as individual meal offerings. They're made of wheat. We don't have individual meal offerings made of barley. The baraisa raises a difficulty. Wait a minute. How do you know? How can you be so sure? Perhaps the verse states these not in order to exclude other meal offerings, but rather to teach a law with regard to one who takes a vow to bring a meal offering. And he says, it is incumbent upon me to bring a meal offering without specifying a particular type of meal offering. And it teaches then, in that case, that he must bring all 5 of them. And the Bryce explains that the verse states of these, which indicates that if the one who took a vow wants, he brings 1 meal offering, and if he wants, he brings all 5. He says it's incumbent, the person vowed to bring a meal offering. Well, then he can choose which meal offerings he's going to bring. He could bring 1, he could bring all 5. It's up to him. He didn't specify when he vowed, so he can choose how he will fulfill that vow. And note that you can bring a gift offering of one of these voluntary meal offerings without vowing to bring it, or you could vow to bring it, and now you become obligated to bring it in order to fulfill your vow. The Brisa continues, Rabbi Shimon says, when the verse states the meal offering in Leviticus 2:8, this serves to include the other meal offerings, for example, the meal offering of Gentiles, and a meal offering brought by women. With regard to the requirement of bringing near, one might have thought that I should include from this verse even the 2 loaves and the showbread that sits on the table in the sanctuary. Therefore, the verse states, of these, which indicates that not all meal offerings are included in the requirement of bringing near. So the Baraisa asks, and what did you see that led you to include the other meal offerings in the requirement of bringing near, and to exclude the 2 loaves of Shavuos and the showbread from the table that sit on the table in the sanctuary? What led you to exclude these from the law of bringing near? Well, because you could have suggested the opposite conclusion, to include these 2 offerings, the 2 loaves of Shavuos and the showbread, while excluding the other ones from bringing near. So the Brisa answers, I include other meal offerings, as there is a portion of them burned in the fire on the altar, and I exclude the 2 loaves and the showbread from the requirement of bringing near, as there's no portion of them that is burned on the altar. There's no reason for them to go up on the altar. They're going to be eaten by the priests. They don't get burned. No part of them gets burned. The frankincense that sits on the table alongside the showbreads, that gets taken to the altar, but the showbreads themselves never go near the altar, so there's no reason to bring them near the altar. The Baraisa asks, but with regard to the meal offering brought with libations, right? So this is a meal offering that is ancillary to an animal offering, a goat or a sheep, for example. But with regard to the meal offering brought with libations, which is entirely burned in the fire, not eaten by priests, no remainder, all of it goes up. By this logic, one might have thought that it also should require bringing near. And the Baraisa answers, the verse states, and you shall bring the meal offering that is made of these to the Lord, and it shall be drawn near to the priest, and he shall bring it near to the altar. And this indicates that the requirement of bringing near applies only to those meal offerings listed in this chapter, not to the meal offering which is brought with libations, and which is not mentioned. The Baraisa asks, but didn't you already derive from the term, and it shall be drawn near, that the meal offering brought by a sota is included in the requirement of bringing near? And the Baraisa answers, as the verse could have stated, and shall be drawn near, and instead it states, and it shall be drawn near. This addition serves to exclude the meal offering brought with libations from the requirement of bringing near. And the Baraisa asks, and what did you see that led you to include the other meal offerings in the requirement of bringing near, and to exclude the meal offering brought with libations from this requirement? Okay, you have an exclusionary term. Why would you apply the exclusion to the meal offering brought with libations? Why not apply the exclusion to one of the other meal offerings? Now we're on page 61a. And the Baraisa answers, I include from this verse the other meal offerings as they come due to themselves, i.e. they do not accompany other offerings. And I exclude the meal offering brought with libations, as it does not come due to itself, but rather together with an animal offering. And the Baraisa challenges, but the meal offering of priests and the meal offering of the anointed priest also come due to themselves. They're not ancillary to some animal offering. And according to this logic, one might have thought that they too would require bringing near, which apparently they don't. And therefore the verse states, and he shall bring it near to the altar to exclude the meal offering of priests and the meal offering of the anointed priest from the requirement of bringing near. And the Baraisa raised a difficulty, but that verse is required for its own sake, i.e. to teach the basic law that a meal offering requires bringing near to the altar. And the Baraisa answers, this law is derived from the fact that the verse could have stated just, and he shall bring, and instead it states, and he shall bring it. So the Baraisa asks, and what did you see that led you to include the other meal offerings in the requirement of bringing near, and to exclude the meal offering of priests and the meal offering of the anointed priests? The Baraisa answers, I include the other meal offerings as there is a part of them that is burned on the altar in the fire, and they come due to themselves, and there is a part of them that is given to the priests to eat. And so I exclude the 2 loaves and the showbread as there is no part of them that is brought on the fire in the altar. And I exclude the meal offering brought with libations, as it does not come due to itself. And I also exclude the meal offering of priests and the meal offering of the anointed priest, as there is no part of them that is eaten by the priest. They are burned entirely on the altar. The Brisa continues, the verse states, quote, and the priest shall take off from the meal offering its memorial part, and shall make it smoke upon the altar. That's the handful that is burned on the altar. An offering made by fire of a pleasing aroma to the Lord in Leviticus 2:9. So with regard to the phrase, and the priest shall take off, one might have thought the priest may perform this action even with a vessel. Therefore, the verse states, and this is the law of the meal offering. The sons of Aaron shall offer it before the Lord in front of the altar, and he shall take it, and he shall take off from it his handful. In Leviticus 6, verses 7 and 8. So, just as the taking off that is stated below is performed specifically with the priest's handful and not with a vessel, so too, the taking off that is stated here must be performed with the priest's handful, his hand to take out the handful, not some vessel to remove the handful. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. We move on to Mishnah 6 here in chapter 5. Mishnah 6, there are the items that require waving and do not require bringing near, right? We've been talking about items that require bringing near, but not waving. Now we're going to talk about meal offerings that require waving, but do not require bringing near. Which are they? The log of oil that accompanies the guilt offering of a mitzorah and his guilt offering itself, as it is written, and the priest shall take one of the lambs and sacrifice it for a guilt offering, and the log of oil, and wave them for a wave offering before the Lord, in Leviticus 14:12. And the bikurim, the first fruits, in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and the sacrificial portions of peace offerings of an individual, and their breast and thigh, as it is written. Now, these are animal offerings when they're brought as peace offerings. The thigh of heaving and the breast of waving shall they bring with the offerings of the portions consumed by fire, to wave it for a wave offering before the Lord. And then the rest of the peace offering is going to be eaten by its owners. I think some of it goes to the priests as well, but there are parts that go up on the fire of the altar. And these peace offerings, this offering of the mitzorah, after he's cured of his tsaras, and he's bringing these required offerings to finish his purification before he can rejoin the community, and the first fruits that are brought, once a year when a person makes a pilgrimage festival, and he comes to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festival when the temple is standing there, and he brings the first fruits of his harvest. All these require waving, but they don't require bringing near. And this requirement applies to peace offerings belonging to both men and to women, by male Jews and not by others. The Gemara will explain this seemingly contradictory statement. It didn't just say men and women, and now it says male Jews only. What? In addition, so it's going to explain that on 61b. In addition, the 2 loaves of Shavuos and the accompanying peace offering of 2 lambs also do not require bringing near, but they do require waving, as it is written, and the priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering before the Lord with the 2 lambs. How does one perform this waving? I recall, I don't know how many weeks ago, Sharon and I were talking a little bit, right, in the Q&A after class. How is the waving done when we're talking about the loaves and the lambs brought on Shavuos? Are we talking about waving the lambs themselves before they're slaughtered? Or are we talking about the meat of the lambs after they're slaughtered? Answer, yes. Both get waved. both before slaughter and after slaughter. There is waving of these lambs, as we shall see. How does one perform this waving? He places the 2 loaves on top of the 2 lambs and places his 2 hands below the loaves and the lambs, extends the offerings to each of the 4 directions, north, south, east, west, and brings them back, and then he raises and lowers them, so the 6 directions. As it is stated with regard to the waving of the ram of the inauguration of the priests, which is waved and which is heaved up in Exodus 29:37, i.e. it is waved back and forth and it is heaved up and down. Waving was able to be performed to the east of the altar, but the bringing near of meal offerings had to be done to the west, i.e. the southwest corner of the altar. And also, with regard to all meal offerings, the wavings precede the actions of bringing near. How do I get from that we wave the lambs before and after slaughter? Because I looked ahead at the actual halacha, how it ended up. According to Rambam, I'll just read it to you. How is the waving of the 2 loaves and the 2 lambs of the peace offering performed? The 2 lambs are brought and waved together while they are still alive. If one waved each lamb by itself, he has still fulfilled his obligation. Afterward, they are slaughtered and they are flayed. Next, a priest takes the breast and thigh from both lambs and places them alongside the 2 loaves and puts both his hands underneath and waves the whole array together in the east of the courtyard where all wavings are performed. And he waves by extending the breast, the thigh, and the loaves to each of the 4 directions. Here too, if he waved each by itself, he has still fulfilled his obligation. Continuing to read Mishnah number 6. The Omer meal offering and the meal offering of jealousy brought by a sota require both bringing near and waving. The meal offering of the Omer requires waving, as it is written, and he shall wave the Omer before the Lord. And likewise, with regard to the meal offering brought by a sota, it is written, and the priest shall take the meal offering of jealousy out of the woman's hand and shall wave the meal offering before the Lord. The requirement of bringing near is derived, as explained earlier. The showbread and the meal offering brought with libations require neither bringing near nor waving. Rabbi Shimon says there are 3 types of offerings that require performance of these 3 commandments. 2 commandments are performed on each and every one of them, but the 3rd commandment is not performed in their sacrifice, meaning that each of these offerings requires 2 out of the same 3 commandments, but not necessarily the same 2 as the others. And these are the 3 offerings. Peace offerings brought as gift offerings by an individual, communal peace offerings, i.e. the 2 lambs brought with the 2 loaves on Shavuos, and the guilt offering of a mitzorah. Peace offerings brought by individuals require placing hands, that's called semicha, on the head of the animals while the animals are still alive, and waving when they are slaughtered. But there is no obligation of waving them while they are alive, as opposed to the peace offering of the 2 lambs on Shavuos. Communal peace offerings require waving, both while the animals are still alive and after they are slaughtered, but there is no obligation of placing hands on them. And the guilt offering of a mitzorah requires placing hands and waving while the animal is still alive, but there is no obligation of waving it after it is slaughtered. That is Mishnah number 6. Now we'll just begin the Gemara on this. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that both the log of oil that accompanies the guilt offering of a recovered mitzorah and the guilt offering itself require waving. And the sages taught in a baraisa, the verse states, and the priest shall take one of the lambs and sacrifice it for a guilt offering and the log of oil, and wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. Leviticus 14:12. And the plural form them teaches that the log of oil and the offering require waving, and that this should be performed with both of them together. And from where is it derived that if the priest waved this one by itself and that one by itself, that he has fulfilled his obligation? The same verse states, in the singular form, and sacrifice it for a guilt offering and wave. since it was stated both as a plural and as a singular. If he does one at a time or both together, either way he can fulfill his obligation. The Gemara inquires, since parts of this verse are in the singular and parts are in the plural, one might have thought that he should wave both together and then wave each one separately. Therefore, the verse states a wave offering, which indicates that he should perform one waving but not multiple wavings. With regard to the phrase, a wave offering before the Lord, the Brisa states that this teaches that waving can be performed to the east of the altar, as taught in the Mishna. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. But doesn't the Tana of a Brisa cited earlier in the tractate 19b say, concerning a verse discussing the bringing near of a meal offering, which states, before the Lord, that one might have thought one brings it to the west of the altar, as this is the side facing the sanctuary? That Tana proceeds to explain that the phrase in front of the altar, Leviticus 6:7, is a reference to the south, where one ascends the altar, and therefore the meal offering must be brought to the southwest corner. And this indicates, though, that the expression before the Lord is a reference to the west. So the Gemara answers the sages' answer by saying, this statement, that the expression before the Lord is a reference to the west and not to the east, applies only with regard to the meal offering, which is called a sin offering. As the verse states, it is most sacred like the sin offering in Leviticus 6:10. And the sin offering requires its remaining blood, when it's an animal sin offering, to be poured out on the base of the altar. Therefore, the meal offering must also be brought to the part of the altar where there is a base. And as the southeast corner of the altar did not have a base, the meal offering must be brought to the southwest corner. In this manner, one fulfills both the requirement of in front of the altar, i.e. to the south, and the requirement of before the Lord. But here, with regard to the log of oil and the guilt offering of a metzora, we call any side of the altar before the Lord. It's simply different physical requirements for how you dispose of that element of the offering. There we'll knock off. We'll just quickly take some questions. Sharon, wouldn't all the sacrifices need to be brought near? Which you're basing on the fact that we call the sacrifices korbanos, which means near, right? Korban, bring near. So I would think that all korbanos would have to be brought near. So apparently not, simply because, the Torah describes them a little bit differently, and the sages didn't read it like you did. I think what you're saying makes sense, but that's not how they read it. What can we do? Tom, is the stringency in order to deter a voluntary and therefore unnecessary ritual? That's an interesting question, right? We've seen that when it comes to vows, right, you don't need to make a vow. And therefore, if you do make a vow and therefore obligate yourself, we've seen that the sages look down on people taking vows and making vows. Because now you have a chance to commit a sin when you don't fulfill your obligation that you would have otherwise not had. You wouldn't, that opportunity to sin would not exist if you had not made a vow. However, that's with respect to making a vow. Simply bringing a gift offering to show that you love God and you want to be thankful and give thanks to God, etc. You could make a vow to bring a voluntary offering, and maybe the sages would look down on that. But just bringing the offering without vowing to do it, that's just voluntary. And I don't think there's any reason not to do that. I think on the contrary, it's praiseworthy. But if you're going to do it, you can't just make up the rules of how you're going to do it. Every vow has its stringencies, and so you have to follow them. Maane says, in our Somali culture, we have korban for offering only coffee beans during the feast before the main course. That's so interesting. Thank you. I bet you take coffee really seriously in Somali culture. And I would like to have some Somali coffee sometime. That sounds good. Thank you for that, Monty. And finally, Carolyn, thank you for your post about cremation from earlier. Hello to Nina. I have missed joining AT live sessions. Shalom. Great to have you back, Carolyn. And in case you missed it, I shared a post earlier today. I just don't have time right now to repeat it, but check it out. It's on Facebook and Instagram. I've shared before why it's Jewish law, a very, very clear and emphatic Jewish law that when Jews die, they must be buried and not cremated. Even if the person expresses a wish to be cremated, we don't listen to them. It's just so strongly against Jewish law. And, the person who died is now in the world of truth, and now they know better. And so that final wish we don't follow. If they want to give all their money, to a rabbit in the zoo, we'll do that. But if they want to be cremated, we don't do that. We bury them. And apropos that law and how important that is, I shared a story that was kind of behind why I made that post 2 years ago about the same subject. A friend of mine died, and it was a very powerful, very emotional story. And so please check that out on today's Facebook or Instagram for Accidental Talmudist. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.